Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me for this second week and the fourth lecture. I am now trying to again share my slides, so hopefully all going well. So I'm expecting that you now see the first slide for today. So as you have already probably seen, my 5 lectures, they are linked to one another and sort of rotate around some core topics. So yeah, last week, the previous lecture, we ended with an idea of a construction site and your PhD as a house that you build. And I was mentioning that methodology is the tools, the more concrete ways of doing the building, at least one element of it. So in this talk, I will focus on methodological issues, particularly fieldwork. And for that purpose, I am starting with a very sort of broad overview of an area in translation studies that I am familiar with, and that also is where a lot of fieldwork is being done, sociology of translation and people working in that area. And I'd like to start by talking about sociological imagination very briefly, because this is a term or an idea of what sociology is about that you tend to encounter on page 1 on any introduction to sociology textbook, but it is not necessarily that often talked about in translation studies, where sociology of translation is perhaps more a loose concept rather than a research paradigm where we would discuss our joint issues of methodology and theory building and somehow it's kind of it has been around with that label for 20 years and sociology of translation, the kinds of research predate, as they always do, the labeling. So we've been doing this kind of research for quite some time in translation studies, but we don't really, that no one maybe has felt the need, or somehow it didn't happen that we would have a lot of how to do sociology of translation textbooks or approaches that would kind of sort of set the stage. So it has developed rather freely into the directions that individual researchers have taken it. So I thought I'd start with something that is very basic to sociology and also perhaps underlying my thinking of what sociology of translation is for me, and then also the presentation on fieldwork today. So sociological imagination, it comes from a book with the same title by C. Wright Mills, published in 1959, so quite some time ago, where it was defined as the way sociology understands social reality, as a way how researchers in social sciences should approach their topic. And the bullet point lists a number of elements that are actually they come from the Finnish translation of this book and the foreword of the Finnish translators of this book, and it somehow summarizes what this is about. So it would be an ability to connect seemingly unrelated phenomena and move between levels of analysis, economic, political, psychological, the ones that they mention, and understanding historical and structural dependencies. So to my mind, this signals that a researcher in social sciences need to be kind of, I don't know, innovative, alert, and attuned to what goes on in the surrounding social reality and able to see connections and draw links between different phenomena, different levels, and aim to understand, provide an understanding that is different, somehow different from the contemporary, any contemporary person's understanding of their social surroundings. So this is the second definition by Anthony Giddens kind of highlights the fact that in studying social reality, the researcher is always unavoidably a part of that social reality themselves. So there needs to be a moment of stepping back, a moment of perhaps alienation from the object of study to be able to think away from it, to be able to observe and analyze and theorize about it. So what we have and what we need to do is to create ways of knowing and ways of knowing differently from our everyday life. And C. Wright Mills also describes research as craftsmanship and emphasizes the need for creative methodology to be able to do this distancing, to do this thinking away from the familiar everyday life situations. So I think this resonates for me in translation studies in many ways, and is a backbone for this presentation. So very briefly, and this is I underline this is a very brief history of fieldwork in translation studies, because it has been done a lot and for a long time. And I'd like to start with Eugene A. Naida and the ideas of usability and Bible translation back in the 1960s, where already then there was this idea of testing translations with the actual readership and going out to the field, as the Bible translators did, obviously, to the different societies where they lived and preached, and then also produced Bible translations. So the sources for fieldwork are actually quite far embedded in the disciplinary history already before the actual discipline was developed. Then perhaps as the discipline was taking shape, the focus was in different elements, slightly different approaches, where fieldwork was not seen as the most logical or obvious way of gaining new understandings. So for quite some time, there's at least less of that, until maybe towards the 1990s, from reception studies, from literary reception studies, the idea of the readers and readerships and reception again gained prominence, and the first approaches then were similar to in literary studies on institutional reception, i.e. sort of published critiques, for example, on literary translations. But then the boom really started in the early 2000s, and I think around the turn of the millennia, it's a fascinating moment in translation studies, because at the same time, more or less, we had a massive boost in two very opposing approaches to looking into translation. So corpus studies were really sort of getting on big time, and at the same time, the seeds of fieldwork interests were beginning to be set in a new manner. And I'd like to, this is an anecdote, but I'd like to recount this to you, because it so happens that I am here today and Hanna Risku will be here or in this virtual space next year. So I'd like to tell you an anecdote about the ESD Congress in Copenhagen in 2001, where Hanna and myself, we were sitting in the audience after the plenary session, one of the plenary sessions, when the next session to start was a session, a workshop, or a session, a panel, I think in the ESD, on corpus studies. And we were sitting in the massive lecture hall, looking at everybody literally running to get a space in the hall, because it was the most interesting, the fascinating, the hottest topic in the Copenhagen ESD Congress, and everybody wanted to be part of it. Everybody wanted to hear what it is all about, and we were sitting there, and I was looking at Hanna, and Hanna was looking at me, and then Hanna said that I'm so totally gonna be in the margins of translation studies, because what I am about to embark on is an ethnographic research on project managers. So, and I was like, yeah, I know. I was at that moment, I was going to interview the EU translators. I didn't realize that I would be actually sort of going into the ethnography direction myself. But we were both there kind of thinking that we lost the plot maybe of what everybody else is seeing in translation studies. But with hindsight, we now can see that actually these two phenomena coincided, and it maybe a little bit later, but certainly soon enough, sociology of translation was another boom. Started very much by Michaela Wolf and her colleagues, and a conference in Graz and new publications, and also the idea of fieldwork started spreading very fast and wide, particularly and before translation. I need to underline in interpreting studies. So for example, Claudia Angelelli's work in interpreting and some others also predated similar ideas in looking into translators or project managers, which was Hanna's interesting opening at that time to see the other actors who also work in the networks where translators also work. But since then what we've seen is a real boom on ethnography, and I checked a while ago, and there's more than 150 publications with this keyword now in the translation studies bibliography. So for a small field, a lot of people are now doing ethnography in particular, or use that as a keyword to describe their work. So from looking into the reception side readers, we now have a real boom in different approaches to fieldwork and ethnography in translation studies. I'd like to also start, because concepts has been my thing, and defining the terms that I use. I'd like to use this opportunity to say something about the labels of ethnography and fieldwork, and why I have fieldwork and not ethnography in the title of this presentation. So I know I'm a little bit in the minority here, and I know the usage of ethnography has spread, and I also know that different disciplines use it differently. So there are different understandings of what counts as ethnography in different fields. I acknowledge all that, but still I would prefer, if I had the choice, that we use the label ethnography when we talk about research designs and research experiences that are embodied and embedded. So the researcher actually is sharing the same realm, be that in real life or virtually, with the other participants, and somehow sort of immersed into the actual reality of the members. And where observation is a key method that is not only reported as having been done, but it's also analyzed, it's also used extensively. The fieldwork findings are also used extensively in understanding and in reporting the findings, where the researcher goes to the field with an open mind rather than a set of predefined research questions that they want answers to. So the open-endedness of research would, to me, signal ethnography, and the more narrow scope, for a more narrow scope, I would prefer calling the approach fieldwork rather than ethnography. Also focusing on the members' understanding of what is going on, rather than sort of having a set of preset idea of what is to be expected and how that is going to be playing out in the field, with the aim of understanding the culture rather than particular elements of the work process, for example, would be a hallmark of ethnography, and also aiming at a thick description. So as you can see, my concept of ethnography is pretty much aligned with an anthropological understanding. And I know that this is not the only way in today's world, but I think it would make sense to try and keep this distinction a little bit. And therefore, I'm arguing that we might might rather use fieldwork as an umbrella term and ethnography as one way of doing fieldwork for any research that entails on-site data collection rather than laboratory experiments or office work or harvesting data from the digital realm and so on and so forth. So all the different kinds of doing on-site research are not, in my head, necessarily ethnography. And I think I wanted to tell you this because this may affect some of you sometimes, because some of you may be doing your PhD in the context of calling it an ethnography, and that is obviously your choice, your decision. But I'm just letting you know that as a as a reviewer, I tend to get a lot of requests to provide a review of articles in this realm. So if you have a keyword that says ethnography, I think a number of journal editors will have ticked my name. It seems so. And if I review articles that say that they are ethnography, and the article only reports findings from interview data, for example, I would note this in my feedback and say that I don't see. So I think this would be better labeled as an interview study rather than calling it an ethnography. And I'm thinking I may not be the only one. So just so that you know, people have different understandings of what counts as an ethnography, and mine is a bit more narrow than for some others. Just as perhaps an opportunity to clear this up, because often in the reviewing process, it's kind of more hidden why your particular feedback has been given to you. So in current TS, a lot of fieldwork is happening, and this is my take on sort of a snapshot of the field at the moment. So it seems to me that the main focus is on ethnographies, also sort of studies called ethnographies. Many of them are, some perhaps not necessarily, on professional translating and interpreting. What happens, and I understand why this happens, is that and I will talk about it in a minute. There's a dominance of talk rather than observations and artifacts that are also sort of part of ethnography. So it easily happens, and this is what I suspect will have happened to the authors of these articles, that it is so much easier to find relevant stuff in your interview data where people verbalize many things that you wanted to find out and you were able to ask. So it's much harder to try and work your way through the analysis of artifacts, for example, or the material environment, or like embodied approaches to work or whatever. So we are trained to deal with words also as translators. Many of you probably have translator background or translator training, so words are easy to handle. Other kinds of elements in your data are much more difficult. So easily you tilt, without even necessarily noticing it, you tilt towards what has been said by the participants. I also have a feeling that processes and contexts are studied more than products, and I'm now meaning particularly translation. So in sociology of translation, perhaps we overlook translations a little bit, and I'll talk more about this later. And also now more and more, it is clear that since as I think I mentioned before, cognitive translation studies is the latest boom seems to be in that direction. So also cognitive ethnography is gaining ground. So we are getting a lot of PhD students getting interested in cognitive ethnography, which is a different kind of ethnography from what I was just describing. So just so you know, the labels are going to be used differently also in the future. What we also have, at least a little bit, is autoethnography, and that I find an interesting new avenue, not often well received or easy to do, but a possibility for translation studies in terms of taking into account the practice background of many of the scholars, and also a reminder of the unavoidable positionality of any researcher. In autoethnography, you need to really think through of who you are doing research, and this is a task for any researcher, but we sometimes are less pressed to do that in other research designs. Increasingly, and this is something that we talked about last week, increasingly also in volunteer and non-professional settings, and also in the paraprofessional area, mainly for now in journalistic translation, less so yet in other paraprofessional fields of translations, translating or interpreting. So what we are talking about today is a popular approach to collecting data in current translation studies. I can see there's a question on cognitive ethnography. Let me just direct you to a recent article by Hanna Risku and Regina Rogl, just maybe a month ago, where they compare cognitive ethnography and sociology of translation, and you will find some definitions there. Translating and the Journal of Translating and Interpreting. It's online. It's available online, so you'll probably find it if you Google their names and cognitive ethnography. So sociology of translation. So how would I define that, or how does it seem to me? And as I said in the beginning, I feel it is not really. There's a number of people are using that label, but it is not really a coherent paradigm that has been sort of developed intentionally by anyone. What we have is a dominance of translator studies. This is a term coined by Andrew Chesterman. I must say I'm not necessarily too keen on it myself, but it has been taking ground. So many people are now using that label, and then they are looking at the translators, their habitus often, or their agency. Why I find this a little bit difficult, or why I don't like the emphasis in this term, is that in sociology of translation, the kind of the, or at least in sociology, the kind of the idea is to look at agents within structures. So not only looking at the translator, but understanding the translator in the institutional context and the historical trajectory and the sort of the overall picture. And if we talk about translator studies, and if we use that as a label, it kind of gives you, it allows you, it says it's okay to ignore the social in the sociology of translation in a way, and allows you to focus very much on the individual. And this I don't think this is the best focus for sociology of translation. Hence, although I understand that translator studies, it's kind of a useful label to define a set of studies that actually do focus on the individuals, but there's a little bit of a tension in how this fits with sociology of translation, in my mind. What is also quite clear is that the pet sociologist for translation studies has from the start been Pierre Bourdieu, and the focus on habitus and the centrality of translator studies, they kind of go together. So this is where we've been collectively a lot. Interestingly, Bourdieu as an ethnographer is not a topic that is often discussed. So his work as an ethnographer, or modeling his approaches in terms of creating your methodologies, is less used than the core concepts, the social capital and habitus and some others. So we've taken on board Bourdieu on a conceptual level and less on the methodological level. And as I said, ethnography is a trendy label. Many use that, and well, myself included, maybe using that loosely. So sometimes perhaps other labels might be more appropriate. A lot of mixed methods is being used, and they tend to often be survey plus interview, which is a good combination really in many ways, but also perhaps, well, not to be selected without thinking about other options too, because survey and interview, they are kind of standard. They are standard ways of knowing, and as I will be talking more about towards the end of this talk, there's room for other approaches as well, and there might be reasons why we want to sort of spread our methodological palette wider than just the most sort of easily thought about and most often seen also, because obviously when we start our research project, we base our approach on what we've seen other people use. So it seems to be a repeated way of approaching sociology of translation to do a survey and then do interviews. And I'm not saying that this should not be done. I'm just saying that there are also other options. Also, there's a number of tensions in terms of where we draw the line. And the tension between historical and sociological research has been there from the start. And this is something that I know very well personally, because throughout my career, I've worked very closely together with Outi Paloposki, a Finnish translation historian. Many of you will recognize her name. And because we've been working together, particularly on retranslation, which is a sort of it automatically has a historical perspective, because there's a time element sort of brought into retranslation from the beginning. So I very personally know how differently a historian and a sociologist, if I'm calling myself that, how we approach our data, how we sort of work on what we have. And it is intuitively very easy to see where the difference lies, but it has been impossible for us to put that in writing. We actually have had for more than 10 years, we've had a draft article that we plan to write together about the differences between history of translation and sociology of translation. And it's kind of difficult to put your finger on it, because sociology is also, it takes into account a historical perspective, and history is a social science. So they go hand in hand, but they are still kind of different. And more recently, this is the Risku and Rogl reference, by the way. More recently, now we have cognitive translation studies and sociology of translation sort of kind of trying to figure out collectively how where to draw the line and how to work together, and whether there's a shared ground. Obviously, some of you in the audience will recognize that we've had discussions of shared ground before in the discipline. Back in 2000 and maybe 2001 and 2, we had a big discussion about shared ground, and I can see that there's another discussion maybe coming up, and Risku and Rogl are starting this discussion. It's a very nice article, I suggest you might want to read it, on how and to what extent we are dealing with the same kinds of questions and the same kinds of issues, same kinds of methods and data, and to what extent it is actually two different pathways. And I think the discussion needs to continue. So what I have been doing in terms of moving forward the sociology of translation approach, I must say I was working on this book that some of you may recognize. This is not a recent one. It was published in 2008, but it actually is still the most cited publication I've ever written. So many of you may have read it. So I was working on this when Michaela Wolf was publishing the first programmatic papers on sociology of translation, and I was so happy. I was like, oh my gosh, somebody's giving a label to something that I've been sort of doing all my sort of my research career. So I really felt like, yes, I want to belong. Sometimes later I somehow felt that maybe I'm not sure if I do, but at that point I really felt that this is my home now, that I have a place in translation studies, a named place where I can be. So what I was doing in the Translating Institutions book was to aim to study both texts and people in their institutional habitat. So you can recognize the agents and structure modeling from sociology in the description. So what the book entails is it is actually, it aimed to be a methods book. and I know many PhD students have found it useful in the sense that I try to be very transparent about the methods that I use so that others can make up their mind whether they want to do something similar or develop them further. But what I wanted to look at was 3 levels or 3 strata of phenomena in that area. First, the institutional and material environment. And with the material environment, I tried myself to do what I was just asking everybody to do a while ago, to look at the artifacts, to look at the architecture of the building, to look at the layout of the offices and what people have on their walls and so on and so forth, to also use that as a basis of my analysis of their culture. And to look at the Finnish unit as a social group, not as individuals, not to look at translators and their habitus, individual translators, but to look at the social group who shared the same language, at least one shared language, and to study their culture. And that's why I had focus groups rather than individual interviews in my setup. So as you can see, I also used interviews, a particular kind of interviews, to get them to verbalize what their thoughts are. So I totally understand why this verbalization is needed in fieldwork and how it can easily be the focus of your attention. And thirdly, I looked at the draft versions of one source text, one source text, and its translated versions into Finnish, trying to tie this into the group culture and their reported understanding of the translator's status and position and role and what they thought they needed to do. And I think with hindsight, I think that this third one really has not flown too well. So I have had many thank you notes from PhD students about the ethnographic fieldwork element for example, in helping them to persuade their supervisors that someone can do fieldwork in translation studies. It was only a while ago that this was a little bit of a no-no for many, that this is not a method in translation studies. It's hard to believe now because it is in all the textbooks and it is one of the standard methods in translation studies to do some kind of fieldwork. But back in maybe even 10 years ago, it was less so. And the latest comment like this was 2016, that somebody from a country I can't remember even, luckily, where from, but somebody was saying that in back home, it was considered not an appropriate method for translation scholar. And my book allowed them to explain why this actually is one of the ways to go in translation studies. But what I have kind of felt is that the idea of also looking at texts in their institutional habitats and to use the use of translations, the texts themselves as your data set was far less enticing for other scholars. So this is the same old in translation studies. We are looking at translations, we are analyzing the shifts and so on and so forth. So it didn't sort of catch the imagination of other scholars in a manner similar to the focus groups or the ethnographic approach as such. So I kind of feel that I was unable to explain why and how I felt also translations can be part of the ethnographic data. So I've tried to do that again quite recently. And so my latest attempt at providing methodological help into studying translations in the wild has been in this book that you see the cover of, where I propose something that I label. Again, I'm labeling something new. So many of you may be thinking that this is not a good way to go, always providing a new label. But I've now called what I tried to do already back in 2008, translatorial linguistic ethnography. And importantly, this proposal is not directed at translation scholars per se. This is a book for organization studies scholars and international business scholars who are interested in multilingual workplaces. So this is my contribution from translation studies to these scholars, explaining how they could move forward in their fieldwork in understanding better what goes on in translation workplaces or workplaces that are multilingual and therefore translatorial. So what I am proposing for them is an approach that will also take into account translation products as artifacts of ethnography and really look into the textual setup that evolves in the processes that they are observing and following the processes. So following the translation, because many translations, they are not drafted at one go, particularly in organizations. They are commented on, there's feedback, they are redrafted, there's versions. So following all these different versions and the negotiations and the gradual gestation of a finalized textual product as an additional sort of a new angle to what they have been studying for quite some time already. So interestingly, in my experience, at least, when people in organization studies are calling translation studies people for help, they don't need us to conduct the interviews. They are really, really good at doing interviews. Interview is king in their fields, as they say. So they do a lot of interviews. But what they don't know how to handle is the textual material. They don't have the vocabulary. They are not. Their eye is not attuned to discerning the subtle differences in the different language versions, for example. So this is where translation studies people can come to help. It's been a little bit, perhaps even a disappointment, perhaps for me, because this is not really my area of expertise. Many scholars in translation studies are far better than I am in analyzing the nitty-gritty linguistic elements in the different versions. And I have always sort of seen myself as somebody who's looking at the bigger picture and also sort of reaching out beyond translations. But it seems obvious to me that what they actually benefit most is kind of the rather perhaps classic approaches to comparative analysis of target and source when we are doing interdisciplinary work. This is where we can really give them something that they don't have. We can also contribute into doing other kinds of analysis, but this is something that we really can provide in a manner that is our specialty. But so we'll see. This is a fairly recent paper, and I look forward to seeing if anyone takes me up on this. I know there's some attempts at getting funding for fieldwork, but none happening with this label yet. So we'll see. But this is perhaps what I now feel is somehow a contribution that I could make from translation studies to the interdisciplinary discussions, how to work with translations in very concrete, in a very concrete manner. Now, briefly, for those of you who haven't been listening to all my lectures, for those of you who were there last week, you will be like, aha, we know this already. But just briefly, I will now move on to talk about paraprofessional translation in particular, and so a definition of what that is. So those multilingual workplaces that I was talking about just during the previous slide, they tend to be filled with people who are not necessarily or not employed by translators, but end up translating as part of their regular work in another professional capacity. So people who are hired to do something else, like HR management or shop floor, even sort of using particular tools or whatever, and they end up operating multilingually. So they get information in a different language. They have co-workers who speak different languages, different situations, and they end up providing written or oral re-rendering of content at their work without necessarily even recognizing that they are translating or interpreting, not using these terms, but working translatorially. And this translation in the wild, in comparison to people like European Commission translators, is very different to analyze, to study, to observe. So the muddy everyday life and its continuums and fragments of translatoriality, it kind of the result is that researchers do not all share the same idea of what counts as translation or translatoriality, and the informants even less so. So this means that although we may think that interview is a wonderful opportunity to gather information, and while it probably works pretty well when you are interviewing professional translators and interpreters or revisers or editors, with whom you can kind of confidently assume that they have an idea of what their professional performance consists of, and they have terms and concepts and verbalizations that they can use. In contrast, when you go to the paraprofessional area, the ideas and understandings become a challenge. So how to ask about an activity that does not necessarily have a name for the interviewee, and also for the interviewer, is not entirely clear, especially at the beginning of what it entails in this particular workplace. So you need to be very open-ended in your questions and avoid offering labels, and your own conceptions that you've needed, for example, to get to your research questions, can restrict your mind really in ways of what you might encounter, what you need to ask about. So it seems to me that at this point, at least when we know rather little about paraprofessional translation in many settings, it is better to observe first before eliciting verbalizations of what goes on. Hence the necessity for fieldwork. I was talking about C. Wright Mills just at the beginning briefly about the sociological imagination, and when preparing this lecture, I was reading his work, and I was reminded about what he says about empirical work, and his take was that he tries to avoid doing empirical work whenever possible, and only resort to empirical work when other approaches fail, more or less. So this is perhaps also something that we might pause and think whether it is always better to collect more data, and whether it's always necessary to go to the field, and whether sort of are we perhaps a little bit fixated on empirical research in contemporary translation studies. But in paraprofessional translation, I feel that fieldwork is what needs to be done at this moment, because it is a very exploratory phase of an under-researched area that is likely to vary in different contexts. So what we know about, for example, journalistic translation, we don't know if anything at all similar will happen among cleaning ladies that need to communicate at work. It might be something entirely different, that probably is. It's not always identified by practitioners, so you can't really only rely on surveys, for example. So we need to observe so that we can move forward to other methods. Obviously, there are also limits of fieldwork, and this is where the verbalizations come into play. It is kind of annoyingly difficult to observe translating. There's very little actually happening when you see a translator translating. Sort of, it happens on the screen, in the head, and in perhaps in virtual networks nowadays, but in comparison to interpreting, that is sort of happening in the time space that this can be shared by the researcher and audible and visible to everyone. Translating is kind of difficult to observe, so this probably explains partially why we rely on interview data so much, because this is a way of penetrating the process. while we have a long tradition of think aloud protocols and asking questions about the process, naturally occurring verbalizations are pretty rare. So if you try to, like, for example, observe translators negotiating about what they do, they particularly talk, is rare. We can find their commentaries in the emails and in the comment sections of documents, but they don't really. This is not the kind of work that is talked about a lot. But also, but then the difficulty is that interview, which is the obvious solution really, when you are finding limitations in your observations, you start finding informants or doing interviews. The difficulty, at least one of them, is that interview is so widely known and used. Social scientists actually are saying that we are living in, have been saying for a while that we live in an interview society, that everybody has in their head an idea of what interview is like. And this is affecting both the questions of the interviewer and the responses of the interviewee in ways that are not necessarily open to new kinds of co-creational spaces where new knowledge could emerge from the discussion, because we have these roles of these two people in dialogue so much in our heads. So hence, and I'm moving on to creativity, although I can see that I don't have too much time, hence room for creativity in fieldwork, in doing other things beyond observations and interviewing. And to start this discussion about creativity, perhaps a reminder, all research actually is creative. Creativity is already there in your survey design and your theoretical thinking and your conceptualizations. You are doing creative work all the time, but you can also emphasize it. You can sort of push the creativity further. And I am on this slide, I have a couple of ideas of what this might entail, and I'm not arguing that this is a list that covers everything. It's more to get you thinking about what you might do. It is also not a list that I could say that I've done all of this myself, far from it, but I tried to give you some indications that I can talk about because I've used them myself. So before I start discussing these, just perhaps a promotional moment. If your university is an IDTS member, so IDTS is the International Doctorate of Translation Studies Network. And if your university is a member, you can actually, if you get interested in some of these creative ideas, you can ask your university representative. If you don't have that information already, ask them. You can find this information on the IDTS net site, who is the representative, and they will give you a password to the members only side of the website, and you will find Nike Pokon interviewing me about 2 creative methods, that the ones that are in brackets here. So if you want to learn more, you can watch these maybe half an hour, 1 hour interviews and see if they spark your imagination and allow you to think creatively about what you might want to do. So what we can try to do is first of all, try and think of ways of eliciting data if observation is difficult, if observation is hard and interview is kind of a little bit rigid because of its familiarity and standardization. What else can you do? What other ways of collecting verbalizations might there be at your disposal? And what I have done is to collect love and breakup letters from translators about they were free to write about an aspect of their work that they really, really love or that they absolutely hate and would want to get rid of. And I've published a couple of articles on that, and I think that might serve as a, not as an example that you might want to follow, but as an idea that will spark new ideas in your head about what you might want to do on your site and with your participants. What you also might want to think about is how to add nuance to fieldwork practices and its analysis. So as I said, interview data verbalizations tend to dominate in analysis, and I think that is because we are not very attuned to the nuance of observation and what observation actually even is. We don't get a lot of training in doing fieldwork and observing and analyzing what you see and hear and taste and smell and so trying to add nuance into your fieldwork and your field notes will perhaps help you focus on the observation part more than you've been doing so far. As an example, because we've been talking about linguistic landscapes, an option is to take that methodology to help you capture the landscape on the site. This is now in the office because I was thinking about the EU translators where I was looking at their offices and what was posted on the walls, but any site or any other method to help you first to see more and then to analyze it with more rigor and nuance. Third, and this is an area I haven't really been working on too much, but I'd like to move forward more, and I think this will be hopefully actually increasing, is co-researching with the participants. Participatory designs that they actually can join you in creating the new knowledge. Interview is a little bit hierarchical in its design, but there are also other options. But the only thing I have used so far, and only with the students, not in research, is multimodal diary application that allows, in this case, the students to create a visual and a verbal annotation of lecture content. So instead of using the traditional learning diary that is text-based and a long form, having a snapshot and a very short tweet-like summary of what really captured your imagination in the lecture. This could be also sort of taken to the field. And then fourthly, artistic research and practice-based research that is a theoretical interest of mine at the moment. So moving on from autoethnography and taking stock of what autoethnography can give us, perhaps ways of bringing in the practical knowledge that many of us have from our personal experience, past or present, in the fields that we study, to have a more rigorous methodology of bringing that into the table and working with your own practice-based understandings, and also the artistic research, the possibilities of actually doing arts, not only studying artistic translation or translation in the arts, but actually having an embodied artistic research project. This is something that seems to be sort of emerging in the accessibility studies, which is another boom in translation studies related to accessibility. The artistic element tends to be perhaps a little more forthcoming in that area. But these are some of the ideas or possibilities of doing, finding creative new ways of understanding your site and answering your research questions. And I have 2 more slides and I'm running out of time, so I try to be very fast. I wanted to give some room to Sherry Simon and her field guide, which is a different take on fieldwork and worth reading by all of you. And her comment on translation as a great teacher, fostering a critical engagement with difference. As a posture of inquiry, an attitude of mind, translation sees all knowledge as resulting from movement, encounter, transfer. And with my final slide, I'd like to leave you with the idea of movement and encounter and transfer, and remind you that in fieldwork, any kind of fieldwork, no researcher can step into the same site twice, because it is not the same researcher and it is not the same site. So this is my final word on fieldwork for today. And I'm sorry we only have a couple of moments. So Peter, do we have any time for questions and comments?
Thank you, Kaisa. Thank you so much for this lecture. And I think we are not the same researchers anymore as we were before attending it. That's a bit the hope of the summer school, that it all changes you. So we do have time. We have about 15 minutes, a bit more even. So if you have any thoughts or questions, please, you can raise your hand, or you can also use the chat box.
I'm just wondering, is it possible to put up your slides again whilst we are discussing, so that we can just check over we've got all the information that we need?
Okay, yeah, yeah. I
Was
just
it
sort of
technically?
Yeah,
maybe technically
sure,
possible.
sure. Yes, I think so.
I'm writing a piece on retranslations at the moment, so I am thrilled that you included that this morning. Great inspiration. Thank you.
Yes, I think now you see the slides again. Yeah,
great.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Merel, you can take the floor.
Good morning. Thank you for this presentation. I thought it was very interesting. I'm working sort of on the overlap between sociological and historical translation myself. So I was struck by your remarks because something I have been struggling with is that a lot of the research I've been reading by other people often focuses on 1 to 3 translators, and I find that one thing I'm concerned about is beginning to psychologize people, historical figures who you don't know, who you don't sometimes not even have a letter from. And you talked about social groups. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, the difference or similarity or going together of historical and sociological approaches is really it's not an easy question, and perhaps I'd like to start from the perspective of a PhD student, because it often comes up in summer schools that people are working with both or considering which way to go or whatnot. And I think the first message, maybe not to you really, but for everybody, is that it will be perfectly all right to only stay within one of these. Because what the biggest problem for PhD students I see is that they try to cover history of translation and the relevant sort of previous literature, yeah, and also sociology of translation and the relevant literature, and try to do two kinds of analysis as they go along, and it is too much because both of these can be rather large in themselves. So my first perhaps comment would be that you don't need to be on both sides at one go. But as to your question on individuals and social groups, it's tricky to I don't know what to say really, because it depends so much on what you want to achieve with your study, and sometimes in both historical and sociological it might make sense to focus on an individual rather than a group, and through that individual to somehow kind of create an understanding of the surrounding environment. But it is probably different from what you had in mind. Perhaps you were talking about psychologizing. And this is something that happens a lot when you are starting your research career, particularly in MA thesis level. This is a typical problem that regardless of the framework, a student analyzing a translation, say a literary translation by some named translator, it kind of you try to step in their shoes and to start explaining what they were thinking, because they were doing this kind of making this kind of a decision in their translation, and this is a risk And I think when you are looking at a particular individual, this is a risk for also more senior scholars that you start rationalizing from the assumed psychological state or kind of without, because you don't know, you don't have access. This is regardless of whether it's a historical person or a sort of a contemporary person. If you don't have access to their thoughts, you can't really. It becomes very sort of hypothetical, all of it. And this is maybe what you had in mind, that this is not what we might want to do. That we want to base our analysis on some evidence, and then argue from that evidence, and not sort of extrapolate into areas that are not extrapolatable from your data. So definitely, and this is a similarity I feel in contemporary and historical research, that you kind of sort of start crawling into the mind of the person that you're studying, and there's a risk involved always. So I don't know if I really managed to answer your question, but thank you for asking it. It is an important topic.
No, thank you.
And then there's a question in the chat. Maybe I'll take that next about autoethnography and ethnography. A good question. I'd like to perhaps start by saying that there are many roles a researcher can take in ethnography. So you can be sort of the ethnography methods book often talk about participant and non-participant and previous participant, and so not all ethnography is participatory in the sense that the researcher tries to be part of the group that they are studying. Sometimes this is the case, sometimes this is taken to the extreme, but it also can be that the researcher sort of remains as an outsider. In autoethnography, what you do, you try to analyze yourself and your activities and your thoughts and feelings and behaviors within this community that you are researching. So you are researching a particular group or particular community, a particular site where you yourself are a member, but via understanding and analyzing your own self. This is not the easiest method, and not everybody. It's also for a PhD student, maybe there's a risk implied, because your PhDs will be criticized and reviewed by many, and not everybody agrees about whether we should be doing autoethnography, and if so, how we should be doing autoethnography. It's a little bit risky, but when done really carefully, it can be very revealing. And in a discipline such as translation studies, where many of us are actually members in many communities that we are also interested in as researchers, I think there's a lot of promise in it, in terms of making this practice researcher position transparent, rather than, as sometimes or maybe often happens, that we kind of take our distance and objectivize ourselves and also maybe sometimes hide our own personal involvement in the group. So I think autoethnography is a good balancing element in the methodological toolbox for those moments where we are actually members. So autoethnography can be used in ethnography, but also other researcher roles are possible, and they are actually also more common.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Any more questions or thoughts? If you want to, you can be a fly on the wall, but you can also be active in this discussion. Raise your voice. You can raise your virtual hand or use the chat box. Yeah, Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kaisa. It was as inspiring as ever, and I love, this is just a short comment, I love that idea of ethnography, because personally, I noticed that it was particularly inspiring, especially when I was stuck with my search of proper research methods, because when you're dealing with real people, it's always complex. And I feel that all my toolbox of methods is not sufficient to cover everything I managed to find. And communication, in my personal case, with people from the disciplines that are really very far from translation studies, for example, people from medicine field or quantum physics, serves as really inspiring for me in search of new methods and new approaches. So now I have the word for it, autoethnography. Thank you very much. So maybe we are not that far from each other in totally different disciplines, as it might seem. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I just comment that I think disciplines are much more similar than we tend to understand, because disciplines are created by creating difference. Sort of the idea is to be different from others, and hence your own discipline. So the starting point is the difference, and therefore we don't necessarily recognize the similarities. But for example, methods, there are very few methods that are really sort of unique to any one discipline. They are we borrow all the time, and everybody does that. In translation studies, we have this self-understanding that we are the borrowers, but actually, sort of, so are the others as well. so this is something that somehow perhaps sort of I understand that when in today's world, PhDs are so sort of pressed with time. You are given such a short time to complete your thesis that it's very difficult to go around. So Irina, it's wonderful if you've had the opportunity to actually talk to many people in many fields and have discussions, but sometimes this is not possible, or you feel like you can't do this. But I think I would urge all of you to have these conversations, even over the coffee table, or sort of go to events where there's also PhD students from other fields, and find these similarities, and sometimes also finding the differences, because there are also differences. It's so enlarges your perspective of, and also allows you to appreciate what you are doing, because the others will then also comment on what you are doing and finding interesting elements in there. So if you have a chance, do take this opportunity, although you have your clock ticking and you have only this many months to complete this part, and this many years before you need to be finished with your PhD. So this is really a valuable time in your career, also to enjoy the academic freedom of having these talks and discussions and reading widely from sources that are not directly, or that you may think are not directly related to what you are doing, but surprisingly you can find a relevant idea from any text anywhere that will help you disentangle a difficult finding, for example, or a thought process that you were kind of not entirely sure how to deal with it. And reading about quantum physics might be the solution suddenly. That opens up a new perspective into what you are doing. So thank you, Irina, for bringing this up. This is a nice addition.
So we have a last question in the chat by Rita Menezes, a researcher researching their colleagues in a group this researcher belongs to. Any advice on dealing with particular tricky situation, for example, participants' reluctance in sharing things? So you have 4 minutes, Kaisa.
Wonderful. This is actually a very nice question at the end, because I wasn't talking about ethics and fieldwork at all. And obviously, whenever you go to anyone and ask them to provide data for you, it is kind of, ethics is, you need to go through this thinking always. And particularly, this is also similar to Rita's question. The moments and situations where you have more than one role, they reveal to you more easily. You kind of have the embodied feeling of the ethical dilemmas. You feel them in your body, and the anxiety and the and you can see that the others are upset, and you need to deal with all kinds of emotions. So they are more at the forefront. But obviously, this same affective side is there for any human research dealing with human subjects. Any advice on dealing with this is what can I say? I think the first thing is to take this seriously, to aim to respect everybody's valuable time and energy that they are giving to you. I recognize I sound like my yoga instructor, but it is really that they are giving you an opportunity for studying them. So you need to be grateful and try to make sure that they don't feel hurt, and to give them a possibility of opting out always. So if they don't want to share something with you, then you accept this. And what ethnography also teaches you is to do members checks, and this might be a practical piece of advice. So before publishing, if you are dealing with data that comes from a particular group, before publishing your articles or your PhD, you can give them a possibility of giving you feedback on it. And at least for me, with the EU book, some of the elements that they considered not okay were entirely surprising for me, because I didn't understand why this was sensitive at all. But for them, some of the details were somehow really, really crucially important. So we need to respect that and kind of leave out the kinds of, this is kind of the do no harm principle, maybe, that our PhD is less important than somebody else's life. So this is the balancing act that you need to do. Sometimes, actually quite often, it is also very interesting to take that reluctance as a significant piece of information in itself, and analyze the reluctance rather than the thing that they are sharing, or actually sort of combining them, so to maybe understand better the group dynamics, or what is important for them, or where the difficulties lie, by recognizing the moments of reluctance and analyzing them, and then using the information in your bigger picture without necessarily writing it up as such. But it allows you to see where the difficulties lie, or where the tough moments arise, and helps you direct your inquiry into that direction in a more indirect ways. So there are many ways of dealing with the tricky situations, but do no harm is the principle that I would go by. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Rita, indeed. And she has another question, but I do not think we can take it, because we're running out of time. The clock is ticking. So she maybe the question can be answered in a tutorial, or maybe later in the summer school, because we need 15 minutes for our yoga session, and then we will have 2 students' presentations. So I really want to express my gratitude, Kaisa, for, and again, a very good lecture, and we already look forward to the lecture of the day after tomorrow, when you will speak about the division of academic labor. So all guests and the participants are invited to attend that as well, using the same link. And we will now close the 4th lecture. So thank you so much, Kaisa, and thank you all the participants. And
thank you all. Thank you all.
Bye bye.